Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of our MintCast podcast. Today, I am joined by two really amazing guests. Ahmed is a journalist and the CEO of African Stream. It's this revolutionary and incredible media company that has been covering Africa's rise and its resistance to U.S. imperialism. And recently, African Stream and Ahmed himself have been caught in the crosshairs of the US State Department because of its success. They have been the target of Antony Blinken himself. He released statements to target and work with big tech to shut down African Stream. And so today, I'm really excited to be joined by Ahmed Kaballo. He's a journalist and editor, director of media or African Stream, who's done an incredible job with this media project. So Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and I'm a big fan of Mint Press and been following for many years, so great honor to be on the show.
We appreciate that support. And of course, I am joined also by Alan McLeod. He is our senior staff writer here at Mint Press, one of the most important journalists, I would say, within the independent media industry, uncovering the paper trails of the 1% war machine. So today we're going to be looking at Africa Rising and the attacks that Ahmed and African Stream have faced themselves. So before we get started, I'm actually going to play this clip by Antony Blinken, and we're going to hear what he had to say when he targeted African Stream.
RT also secretly runs the online platform African Stream across a wide range of social media platforms. Now, according to the outlet's website, African Stream is, and I quote, a pan-African digital media organization based exclusively on social media platforms, focusing on giving a voice to all Africans both at home and abroad. In reality, the only voice it gives is to Kremlin propagandists.
All right, so there you have it. We just heard from Antony Blinken himself calling African Stream a project of RT and a mouthpiece for Kremlin propaganda. So Ahmed, obviously, I'm sure it's been a difficult past month or so with the news that African Stream was shut down and targeted by big tech at the behest of the State Department and Antony Blinken himself. I mean, we could say that's a huge badge of honor when you're U.S., an anti-imperialist running a media organization being targeted by the State Department. But I'm sure this was not easy for you as someone who has built such an incredible platform covering Africa Rising. What do you make of this attack against African Stream and this accusation that it is Kremlin propaganda?
I mean, the latter accusation that we're Kremlin propagandists is insulting, not really so much to us, but to African people. The idea that if you're against imperialism, it's not because you've analyzed the conditions that you're in, not because you understand the relationship of neocolonialism within the African context, that our economies are not owned by us, that 14 African countries use the CFA franc, which keeps its reserves in the Bank of France, which controls the economy of those countries. And the other countries in the African continent are basically hostage to the US dollar. They have to export things just so they can receive US dollars. And if they don't, their currency is devalued, and their whole economy collapses. So if you analyze these situations and you think, well, there's something wrong with this. We're meant to have got our independence in 1958, 1957, 1960, 1961, and so on. But yet, our country's economies are not controlled by us. The people that win elections are the people that's campaigns are best funded, and those are usually that have connections to Western capital. If you analyze these conditions and you say there's something wrong with this, then it's not because you're intelligent enough to understand what's going on within your own context. It's because you're influenced by Russians. And this is something, a trick that has been played time and time again within our continent. They called Patrice Lumumba, they called him the African Castro. They said Thomas Sankara was a Russian agent. They said Nkrumah was a Russian agent before they deposed him. Ahmed Toure. The list goes on and on and on. Nelson Mandela. Now, in the contemporary sense, they say it about Julius Malema. They say it about Ibrahim Traore. They say it about Asimi Goita and Abdurahman Tiani in Niger. No, if you just say, if you're the president of Niger and you say, it's not right that we export uranium, but most of our country is in darkness. If you say that, that's not your own analysis. That's Russian propaganda. So we're not insulted because, you know, we're in very rich company, but it is insulting to African people. And as an African, I'm insulted, not so much as African Stream.
Yeah, it's quite horrible, and it is an insult. You know, you just like I'm a Palestinian American who was very much influenced by living under Israeli occupation and apartheid. Your family is from Sudan, and you watched like your country being split into half by Western imperialist nations, and so I'm sure that played a huge role in your life mission in exposing US imperialism, not just in Sudan, but in other countries across Africa.
Yeah, 100%. Jeffrey Sachs said it best. He said, the US helped to divide Sudan into two republics, and now we've got war in the south and war in the north. Job well done. And yeah, you know, the conflict in Sudan, it doesn't get coverage, it doesn't get reported on, because the Western mainstream narrative has depicted Africa as a place of conflict, so that when people die, it's just seen as normal. When people starve, it's just seen as normal. When people eat cockroaches because they've got no food, it's just normal. When children die because of sanitation issues, you know, my former basketball coach, my mom sent me a WhatsApp message saying your former basketball coach has just died of dengue fever. It's just normal. It's just normal. And so what African Stream was trying to explain is these situations are not normal. These situations are manufactured. And for us to change the direction of the continent that we're connected to, we first need to have an understanding of that being African doesn't mean that we have to be subject to poverty, to destitution, to war. This doesn't have to be the way. You know, if we take control of our resources, if we take control of what is our God-given right, which lies beneath our feet, we can rise. And we're seeing that's what's happened in Burkina Faso, that's what's happening in Mali, and that's what's happening in Niger. But it's not happening in enough countries. I'll just correct you on one thing. You're saying Africa's rising. I wish that was the case. In reality, it's the Sahel that's rising. Most of the other countries within the continent, sadly, are ruled by neo-colonial puppets, from Nigeria to Congo. You know, Congo has just signed the worst peace deal with Rwanda that I think that any sovereign government has ever signed on behalf of the people. They just signed another deal with M23 in Qatar, where they basically, M23 has to give up nothing. The land that it's occupying in Eastern Goma, it gets to hold on to. So these are the neo-colonial governments that our people are subjected to, and this is why the young leadership in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger are such a threat to the rest of the continent, because they're worried that this will have, you know, a domino effect on the rest of the continent. And African Stream was launched in September 2022. Ibrahim Traore came into power in October 2022. So we basically covered our rise and his rise hand in hand. We've covered him from the very beginning. You know, not at the beginning, not everyone was favorable to our coverage, but they did eventually see the light. But that's another reason why I feel like we were so dangerous to the US State Department, because we quickly became, in the English-speaking world, the largest African media platform, reporting accurately on what's going on in the Sahel. You know, the mainstream media would have you believe that there's some sort of sickness in the Sahel. People are just, you know, attracted to many military uniforms. They won't talk about the economic conditions that led to the rise of these free leaders. They won't talk about the security conditions that led to the rise of these free leaders. The Sahel has become the epicenter of the so-called of the so-called war on terror. Yet, before the US and France started supporting these Sahelian states with terror, there was hardly any terrorism within the region. Since they've entered the fray, terrorism has grown by 8 to 10,000%. So the people are frustrated, and they said enough is enough. We need a different type of leadership. And out of the ashes rose Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, Asimi Goita. Asimi Goita was obviously first in Mali, and then finally Abdurahman Tiani in Niger.
Incredible. And I think that this kind of coverage is so important because here in the US, like you said, anything that's happening in Africa is always looked at from like a tribal perspective, or, you know, this famine or this drought or this whatever issue that the Western corporate media is going to be covering is going to be through the lens of colonialism, instead of looking at how Western countries, especially the United States and its military, AFRICOM, corporations that are operating in countries like Nigeria are effectively causing a lot of these issues. And so modern day colonialism, of course, still exists in these countries. It's very, very sad, but it's also inspiring because you've also shined a light on these resistance movements that are standing up to not just US colonialism, but also Israeli expansionism and influence in the region, like in the Sahel. So that's been quite inspiring to see. And I want to get more into that in a bit, but I want to turn to Alan, because Alan has been covering this big tech censorship for Mint Press for a long time. And he's uncovered a lot of the money trails, the Israeli influence, the British influence even. Just how were they able to, Alan, how was Antony Blinken able to maneuver his way into big tech in such a way to shut down African Stream? Like, talk to us more about the mechanisms that were used to shut down African Stream.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say is the reason they targeted African Stream is because of how they covered it. They're scared of what African Stream has to say. They're scared of the message that they were broadcasting to, what was it, between 30 and 40 million people per month African Stream was reaching at its height. And so they went after it. They zapped it. They first tried to smear it as a propaganda outlet of Moscow, which, as Ahmed said, is a very common tactic throughout the decades, trying to associate revolutionary leaders like Patrice Lumumba or Nelson Mandela with somehow being puppets of the Kremlin. It happens to black leaders in the United States as well. Remember all of the talk about Martin Luther King being a secret communist, being, ruled by Moscow. All of this is utter nonsense. And, it's even happening to Mint Press. We are constantly smeared as agents of Russia or as sadists of secretly in the pay of China or Venezuela or whatever bête noire of the United States du jour that they want to throw at us. But this smear, although it's completely factually inaccurate, really stuck. And the reason is that over the past 10 years, big social media platforms have become increasingly intertwined with the US national security state. After the 2016 election, people in Washington started to get very worried and deeply concerned about the power that social media and the internet, more generally, alternative media, can have on influencing the public. It was clear that the powers that be didn't particularly want Donald Trump to get elected in 2016. They preferred Hillary Clinton because she was a more safe pair of hands. That's not because Trump is some radical outsider that's, going to lead the revolution. No, he was just a bit more erratic. And what we've seen in the past 10 years is the big national security state players like the FBI, like the CIA, and like the NSA infiltrating their way into the big social media platforms, bolstering them, but also getting parachuted into very high positions of power and influence, which effectively allow them to control and dictate what everyone in the world sees in their social media feeds. And this is not just an American problem. This is true whether you're in Birmingham, Alabama, or Botswana, Burundi, or Bahrain. This is what's going on all around the world. So it's pretty much state censorship, but on a global level. I'll give you a couple of examples. The person who is ultimately in charge at Facebook for content moderation, ultimately who pulls the trigger on deciding what is allowed and what isn't in terms of content, is a guy called Aaron Berman. Now, until 2019, Aaron Berman was one of the highest ranking members of the CIA, until one day in the summer, he left his job at the CIA and was parachuted into this top position at Facebook, whereby he calls the shots for what the 3 billion users see and don't see in their news feeds. And this is a similar thing happening with Instagram, with TikTok, with Google. All of these platforms have had national security state members dropped in at these points, because ultimately what we see in our news feeds is not random. These are the results of algorithms. And as we've seen with Elon Musk tweaking the algorithm in Twitter constantly, and suddenly it becomes a white nationalist overnight. These algorithms are not set in stone. They're not natural. They are actually programs written by humans, and they reflect the interests of humans and organizations. And so the interest reflected when it comes to big social media nowadays is the interest of the US national security state. And that's why places like Mint Press are constantly deranked, delisted, demoted, and sometimes deleted. And that's ultimately why African Stream was also targeted, because they just simply send the wrong message, a message of revolution, a message of hope, and a message that a better world is possible. And that is absolutely not something that people in Washington want people to be hearing. They do not want people inspired. They want people cowed, downtrodden, and thinking that this is the best of all possible worlds.
And that's absolutely
Can I just
yeah.
can I just add to that point, because there'll be people watching saying, oh, there's other revolutionary media that haven't been taken down, so why African Stream? So let me try answer that question, if I can. What was unique about African Stream is, I don't know how we did it, but we managed to curate a list of very influential, what we call Africans in America, what the mainstream calls African American celebrities, who were following us. And this is who the Democratic Party, in the lead up to an election, this is who they enlist, because they feel like, you know, the African population in the US, they just need their favorite celebrity to tell them who to vote for, and that will win them the black vote. And by and large, that does work. This election, it didn't work as much, but by and large, they did get the black vote. So to some degree, it did work. So I feel like the attack on African Stream, it happened 2 months before the election. There were several attacks by, I won't call them the left, it's the liberal elite media in the US. So the first one was NBC, which they said, African Stream is spreading disinformation to 40 million African Americans. And they said that, and they were citing a report. But they never showed one example of what disinformation we were spreading. However, the examples that they did give for I think it's called the Shade Room and a few other media outlets that were mentioned in the report were all related to Joe Biden. And somewhat encouraging black people not to vote for Joe Biden because of, you know, the crime bill, because of his record, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that was the first kind of warning. And then we did another report where we said, it doesn't matter who gets elected in November, US drones are going to rain down on Somalia. And so we did a report from George W. Bush Barack Obama, Donald Trump to Joe Biden, we listed how many drone strikes each president had rained down on Somalia, and we said that whatever happens with the U.S. election, drones are going to rain down on Somalia. So Voice of America, which is state funded and
Yeah.
openly state funded, came after us with two pieces. So they did a video about us. You can find the video on YouTube. It's hilarious because every single comment is African Stream was the truth. You guys don't know what you're talking about. They got absolutely ratioed. And then they did an article. Now, what was interesting about the Voice of America piece, the first piece by NBC, we did a rebuttal, and our rebuttal was so popular and went so viral that the journalist that wrote the article had to put his Instagram on private. So when the Voice of America did their piece, the journalist didn't want to use their name. So they put one name initially, and she must have contacted a manager. And then another name appeared next to the article, but we took a screenshot and we found out it was a journalist based in Kenya. So it showed that journalists were even afraid to come after us because we had such a big following, because we had such an influential following, particularly amongst what they call Black Twitter, that Black the African in America demographic, especially the celebrities. So I think they would have carried on with these hit pieces if they could have found willing mercenaries. But I think they ran out of willing mercenaries because we kept doing a rebuttal every time that we got attacked. So that's when I feel like it was escalated to Antony Blinken for him to say what he said. And then after he said what he said, within 24 hours, there was an article by the Stanford Observatory. In the article by Stanford Observatory, they'd gone through all of our profiles, the cameramen, mine. I used to work at Press TV, cameraman used to work for CTGN. It was a real deep dive. There's literally no way they could have wrote that article within that time frame. It was clear that the State Department had contacted the journalist beforehand and said, we're going to make this announcement on Friday. We need you to have an article ready by the Monday. And another thing that was revealing is the numbers that she quoted us for the YouTube. You know, they said how many subscribers we had on each platform. The number that she quoted us for YouTube was less than it was when Antony Blinken made the announcement. So clearly she took her data from a period before the announcement, but the article was meant to be a reaction to the announcement. So how do you pre-write an article as a reaction to an announcement before the announcement's made, unless there's some sort of coordination? So I think it's very important. And if we think back to the elections, this was the time where at Democratic Party conventions and events, they would see someone wearing a hijab, a headscarf, someone that looked like they were from West Asia, what they call the Middle East, or, have any sort of symbolism related to Palestine, and it would stop them from going into the event. Because what would happen is people would go into the event, they would shout, Kamala Harris, you're a war criminal, Joe Biden, you're a war criminal, and so on, and that would go viral. And that was seen to be damaging the Democrats' campaign. And we were constantly covering that stuff and also obviously making the connections between what's going on in the continent as well as what's happening, Kamala Harris's record in locking up black and brown people and referring to herself as the top cop. So all of that meant that we were seen as a threat at a key critical time before the US elections. And one more thing that I'll add, if anyone has saw Joe Rogan's interview with Mark Zuckerberg, I'd strongly advise you to watch it, because in that interview, you see how petty the Biden administration was when it came to censorship. So Zuckerberg is saying they'd call me about everything. There was a Tom Cruise meme that went viral, and someone from the administration said that you need to take this down. So if you think they're threatened by a meme, you only have to imagine what something like Mint Press represents, what something like African Stream represents, what something like Grey Zone and some of these other platforms represent.
And it should also be said that only hours after Blinken made this speech, right, that your Instagram, your TikTok, your social medias were all completely deleted and your Twitter was demonetized. And this happened in a period of just hours after Blinken made that speech. So it's clear that, they are totally taking their cue from the US State Department here.
Yeah, there was no process. It's funny because they say you violated community guidelines. Okay, what community guidelines? They don't even say.
We've all received that message before.
Yeah, you violated community guidelines. Your account. So YouTube was the first. You violated community guidelines. Your account's been deleted, and then came the kicker. You can't appeal this decision. Yeah, this was pushed by a so-called Democrat administration.
Yeah,
very democratic. Very democratic.
Well, I would say, and Alan's been around working with MintPress for a while now. I would say the most censorship we faced on social media was when a Democrat was in office. I mean, when Obama was president and Joe Biden was his vice president, and the United States was backing a Saudi-backed blockade of Yemen. I mean, MintPress was literally one of the only media outlets covering the starvation campaign and the famine that was taking place inside of Yemen, and U.S. complicity in that, how the United States was selling Saudi Arabia, record number of weapons. We were refueling Saudi jets before they were bombing hospitals and schools and grain silos and destroying all the farms, how Saudi Arabia was assassinating Yemeni fishermen. And it was our coverage that was targeted in censorship campaigns. We were constantly getting our posts on social media taken down for violating community guidelines because we showed images of starving children. Literally, skeletal Yemeni children, we were showing those images and we were getting violations, and those images were taken down. Carlos Latouf, our cartoonist, he would do cartoons about depicting, the genocide in Yemen. And we would just, every day, we would have one new community guideline violation. And every day on our website even, we would have a community guideline violation for, because we showed too many graphic images. Like, this is all BS. And it basically created, set up the stage for the kind of censorship we're seeing today. I really, really believe that. And in that time, that's when we were actually targeted by Google's Project Owl. So when we say we're facing censorship and we're being demonetized and we're being delisted or whatever, it's because we are. We were and have been and are being deranked. Before the Trump and Hillary Clinton election, MintPress, in any news search result, was one of the first 5 links you would find in Google News. They deranked us. They removed us off of, we're still on Google News. They didn't take us off completely, but they deranked us to page 5. Nobody clicks next to page 5. Nobody goes that far. You're looking at the first page. So who's on the first page now? The New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC. That's who they brought back up to the top page. Whereas at one point, MintPress was literally competing with all of those media outlets, and we were getting so much traffic on our website. And they saw MintPress and our coverage of US imperialism as a threat. And because we were also shining a light on resistance movements and countries and movements pushing back against US imperialism, they deranked us. So, obviously we haven't been taken down per se, but we have been the target of big tech. And we do believe it is at the behest of possibly the State Department and other places. I mean, look what happened to our GoFundMe fundraisers. They were taken down and we were banned from GoFundMe. And we were also banned from PayPal. I believe Alan was also targeted from PayPal after our coverage on Ukraine, because that coverage was going viral and we were exposing, most of it was Alan's coverage, we were exposing, what was it? What was the outlet called, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. That's the Kiev Independent you're talking about. And I mean, our debanking came at just a few days after we now know that other journalists were contacting the UK Secret Services and contacting the famous Biden disinformation czar to try to get us deplatformed or some sort of response from Western governments. So, it doesn't take a mathematician to put two and two together here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I don't want to, derail too much on this topic because, we've been talking about this for a long time. But when we say we're being censored and deranked and all of these things, it's because it really is happening. And we are up against a multi-trillion-dollar corporate media machine. So we were still here. Ahmed, you're still here, and you're still doing amazing things. And we'll talk about that shortly after. But, we still have to push back and fight back. And speaking of the Democratic Party, I do believe that is why Sean King was actually completely deleted off of Meta platforms. Sean King is like a civil rights activist, and he's been covering police brutality for, 2 decades and issues with social justice in the United States. And he amassed millions of followers across all platforms. On Instagram alone, he had almost 2 million followers. On Facebook, he had almost 2 million followers. And right with this last election, he was deleted. Ahmed, do you think that Sean King was removed for similar reasons? Because, he's been quite influential in the African-American space in the United States. And, I've been following him for a long time. He's done really great work on, police brutality coverage.
Definitely. But I'll give more context.
Yeah.
I believe there's acceptable parameters of what a African in America can talk about. Now, you can talk about police brutality, you can talk about race, you can talk about race relations, but as soon as you start to connect the dots with imperialism, with other struggles around the world, that's when you become a danger. Yeah, so it's not a coincidence if we trace back the history of Malcolm X. What was Malcolm doing before he got assassinated? He was visiting African nations and he was saying to them, we are the same as you. We were kidnapped from this continent, but we are the same people. We want you to lobby on our behalf and turn this from a civil rights issue into a human rights issue. Yeah, and we want African states to lobby on our behalf of the diaspora who are struggling. Because when Chinese people are troubled outside of China, the Chinese government acts. So he was advocating for African states to advocate on behalf of African people within the US. Now, Sean King, as you said, he's been talking about police brutality and racism in the US. But in the last few years, he started talking about Palestine, started talking about, the what happened in the place where you're residing in Minnesota, George Floyd, that training that the police were practicing, they'd learned from the occupation forces in Israel. That's when he became dangerous. Yeah, I think had he have kind of stuck to domestic issues and domestic issues only, he probably still would have had a platform. And I also feel like that's where we had an issue as well at African Stream. When we used to talk about Palestine and Gaza and what was going on, and connecting it to settler colonial projects that happen in the continent of Africa, as well as in the north of Ireland. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because that brings a new awakening, and it has the possibility of uniting people in struggles. And so I think it's more to do with not just his criticism of the Democratic Party, but also him connecting the dots. And understanding that the African people in the US are internally colonized. They didn't migrate to the US with a passport on a tourist visa. They were kidnapped, taken hostage, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and then they were put in bondage. That's the history. That's the history of the African experience in the US. What they've tried to do post-Obama is they've tried to convince African people to American, what Ajahn Mubaraka said, calls Americanizing the Negro, getting them on board with the American patriotic imperialist project. and people like Sean King and others were saying, no, why would you be patriotic to an imperialist project? This is what this country does around the world. You're better off connecting with the struggles of the people around the world, because you have more in common with colonized people as an internal colonized group of people in America than you do with the elites and the imperialist war machine that runs you.
About Sean King, I agree with you. I think right towards the end, right before he got banned, he was collaborating with MintPress, with African Stream, about a lot of issues that dealt with US imperialism in other nations, and started to cover more foreign policy and kind of connecting the dots about how we're all, people here that are oppressed have more in common with people that are oppressed overseas. And he was covering, how Israel was training police forces in African countries and contributing to that oppression there. But we've been talking about this issue of censorship for a while now. So people who do follow MintPress know MintPress has actually been leading the charge in the coverage about big tech and the inner workings, and how they're collaborating with the US government to crack down on dissent and alternative media. But I want to move back into resistance movements within Africa. One leader that has drawn special attention is Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Since coming to power in 2022, he has certainly struck a revolutionary tone, nationalizing key industries and expelling French forces. What have you made of Traore, Ahmed, and to what extent is he the real deal?
He is the real deal, and he's a fantastic leader. He's very charismatic, and you need that charisma. But what the comrades in the Sahel keep telling me and emphasizing is it's not just about him. It's the alliance of Sahel states. There's 3 fantastic leaders. Because he's good looking, because he's charismatic, he's muscular, he's the one that's getting all the attention. But all 3 of them are doing fantastic stuff. And this revolution was really started off in Mali. They were the first to kick out French troops. They were the first to kick out French media. And then obviously Burkina Faso followed, and then Niger followed. But this comes out of desire. It's not a top-down movement. This is a movement from the grassroots. These 3 regions have been devastated by terrorism and devastated by neocolonialism. These are some of the poorest countries within the continent. So Niger, before the coup in 2023, was ranked as the 2nd poorest country in the world. Since the coups happened, since they take control of the uranium and some of the mining sector, it's no longer the 2nd poorest country in the world, and it's actually one of the fastest growing economies in not only in the continent but in the planet. In 2024, it had GDP growth between 11 and 12%. Burkina Faso also had GDP growth around 8%. So this goes to show that when you stop being middle management for colonialism, when you stop just being a conduit for the extraction of resources out of your country, then of course we have everything that we need around us. These are not poor countries. These are countries that are overexploited. Yeah, how can a country like Burkina Faso that has all the gold mines, how can a country like Niger, which is rich in not just uranium, but in copper and other materials, how can they be so poor unless their resources were used to enrich others? And the people on the continent understood this. They describe the African as if we're some sort of docile, passive creature that we see. These planes, these fancy planes come in and fly out, and we see all these foreign diplomats come in and fly out, and we don't see the living conditions of our people change, and we don't connect the dots. Of course we connect the dots. We understand
that these countries gained flag independence. They never really became sovereign, independent nations which are governing for the people. And that's what these revolutions represent. But in Burkina Faso in particular, you know, he's done some fantastic stuff, infrastructure projects, set up factories, tomato factories. He's encouraged businesses to come. So patriotic Burkina Bay have come back and set up businesses. He's paved roads. There's an ambitious target of paving 50,000 kilometers of road in the country by 2029. He's enlisted volunteers to help defend the country, and people are enthusiastically doing that. He's made people believe that this is our fight. This is our fight for sovereignty. This is our fight for independence, and this is our fight against terrorism. So right outside the presidential palace, you have a group of volunteers that sleep there day and night, defending the president. So they know that he is embarked on a revolutionary journey, and as part of that revolutionary journey, there is risks, and there's already been assassination attempts on his life because of what this person is trying to achieve. But he is part of a collective within Burkina Faso, and Burkina Faso is part of a collective within the Alliance of Sahel states. So this is a movement, and the movement will only grow. In Ghana, we've just had elections in Ghana. Mahama has just been re-elected. Not re-elected because it's his second term, but there's been an 8-year Nana Akufo-Addo regime in between. And what's interesting, I lived in Ghana during Mahama's first term, and he wasn't speaking like a revolutionary then. But during his inauguration, Captain Ibrahim Traore came, and he got the loudest reception of any leader. And you could literally see it on his face. He was kind of looking at this young man, thinking, I want to get this type of reception. I want to get this type of adulation. So since then, Mahama has gone on a radical program in Ghana. And so that's what's so impressive about Ibrahim Traore. He's not only influencing people like myself and the younger generation, but he's also influencing old statesmen that are at least now trying to adopt revolutionary language, anti-imperialist language, nationalist language, nationalist in a positive sense, because nationalism in countries in the global south is completely different to the type of nationalism that we see in places like Italy and the UK and now in the US. This is nationalism that encourages people to fight for their sovereignty and to fight against the overextending hand of imperialism.
Yeah, nationalism in America means like racism and supporting war and supporting overthrowing governments, whereas nationalism in the global south is supporting worker-led movements, sovereignty, and nationalizing resources, pushing back against US and Western imperialism, without a doubt. I want to play this video. I know you guys are not going to be able to hear it, but I'm going to play this video and I'll say what I'm playing. It's of Ibrahim Traore talking about the wealth in Africa. So I'm going to play 1 second.
Les questions que mes générations se posent sont les suivantes, si je peux me résumer. C'est de ne pas comprendre comment l'Afrique, avec tant de richesses sur notre sol, avec une nature généreuse, de l'eau, du soleil, en abondance, l'Afrique est aujourd'hui le continent le plus pauvre. L'Afrique est un continent affamé. Et comment se fait-il que les chefs d'État traversent donc le monde à mendier? Voici des questions que nous nous posons et que nous n'avons pas de réponse jusque-là. Nous avons l'occasion de tisser de nouvelles relations. Et j'espère que ces relations puissent être les meilleures pour donner un meilleur avenir à nos peuples. Pour ce qui concerne le Burkina Faso, aujourd'hui nous sommes confrontés depuis plus de 8 ans à la forme de manifestation la plus barbare, la plus violente du néocolonialisme, de l'impérialisme. L'esclavage qu'on tend encore à nous imposer.
All right, so that was Ibrahim Traore talking about how Africa is so rich, has abundant sun, soil, and resources, and yet African leaders are reaching out to Western nations and countries for help. And why is that? And he wants to change that outcome for Africa. And so this man obviously needs to be protected at all costs, just like any other revolutionary leader that rises from the ashes to defend their nation, to defend their resources, to defend their land from occupiers. You know, I don't want to give a grim outlook to what could happen to Ibrahim Traore, but history does tell us that, you know, the US and other Western countries like Great Britain and France don't take these words very lightly. And there could be things happening on the ground to promote regime change, for example. And that's why you mentioned, like, there's a lot of guards guarding his palace, or not his palace, his home, excuse me, guarding his home, guarding him, because people are aware on the ground to what extent the United States and these Western countries will go to overthrow, assassinate, and to foment maybe like a coup on the ground. Do you see that as a possibility in the near future for Ibrahim Traore? Either one of you guys can answer this question.
I'll jump in just quickly, if you don't mind, Alan. Sorry. I think they're going to have to try really hard to do that, because they put out the feelers with the head of AFRICOM. I forget his name now. Name's escaped me.
General Michael Langley, are you talking about?
Yes. Thank you, General Michael Langley. When he made this ridiculous statement where he said that Ibrahim Traore is using the country's gold reserves for his private security. Yeah, it's such a ridiculous thing to say, because firstly, he's the president of a sovereign nation. Secondly, there's been several assassination attempts on him. So using money, the state's resources, for security is a legitimate thing to do. Has anyone seen the US president? How much is spent on his security? Whenever a US president flies somewhere, there's always like how many accompanying F-fighter jets and helicopters and whatnot. How much does that cost? Does that not come out of the state budget? So it was a ridiculous thing to say anyway. But what was brilliant, and actually in my 36 years on Earth, it was the proudest moment I've had as an African, was the mobilization that happened around the world. We had protests in London, in Jamaica, in the US, in Spain, in France, literally in Nigeria there was a protest, but before they could get going, they got arrested. But in South Africa, literally the whole African global community came out. And that was off that small thing that General Michael Langley said. Now imagine if they were to dare, try put this person on house arrest, or God forbid, try take him out. There would be riots in every major city in the world. So I think that was a little feeler that they put out. Let Michael Langley say something. Let Uncle Tom, House Negro, say something. Let's see how it plays out. And they got an emphatic response by the global African community.
It's interesting the way you framed that question, Manar, about a coup in the near future, because there was actually a coup attempt that Traore survived in the near past, which happened in April, and it was just days after General Langley spoke before the Senate and accused Traore of allowing Russia and China both to gain a foothold in Africa through Burkina Faso, which is actually kind of a similar accusation as African Stream and MintPress gets thrown at them constantly, that we're, the dupes of foreign powers. And yet, only a few days after Langley said this, there was potentially a foreign orchestrated coup attempt in the country that did not succeed, because it was found out quickly, and there was also a very large popular presence against that. So, frankly, this is the sort of thing you have to deal with if you are a revolutionary leader. Fidel Castro famously He survived more than 600 American attempts on his life during his lifetime and died at an old age. President Nicolas Maduro and before him President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela had to survive multiple coup attempts, which I know actually Ahmed knows a fair amount about as well. So this is just par for the course when you are a revolutionary leader. If you stand up to the United States, expect to have to dodge some punches.
100%. There's a famous quote by Samora Machel, where he says, "If they praise me, know that I've betrayed you, and if they talk about and if they talk about me bad, know that I served you well." So these guys know what they're getting into, and that's why we love it, and we completely understand it. But he doesn't go into a meeting without the gun holster on display. So some people say it's a bit disrespectful, but no, we understand. We've had too many leaders assassinated. Go into every single meeting with that gun strapped to your waist. That leave nothing unturned.
I mean, they tried to disarm, the Black Panthers. They were always, showing their rifles and their guns. People look at that and say, oh, they're violent, but actually it was in self-defense because so many African-American leaders were assassinated and targeted.
Yeah, and on a national level, of course, it was only when Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi actually gave up his weapons of mass destruction and his forces that he was attacked by NATO and overthrown in 2011. So there's a lesson there as well.
Yeah, and I brought up the Black Panthers. I know it's not a foreign policy story, but it's like the same struggle here that many people can relate to in the United States when looking at, revolutionary leaders. Why are they holding their rifles and their guns, and why is that? It's because they are the target of these assassination campaigns. And I wish we had so much more time to talk about all of these issues, but let's move on to talk about Gaza, because it's such a horrific genocide. All genocides are horrific, obviously, but this one's being live streamed in 4K, this genocide in Gaza. And it's like every single day that goes by, when you think you've just seen the worst to come out of Gaza, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And we've obviously covered a lot of war issues in the past in our nearly 14 years being a media outlet in the United States. But this one is obviously very close to home to myself, especially I'm Palestinian American. I am a survivor of Israeli occupation and apartheid. But what's happening in Gaza is something that we in the West Bank or in Jerusalem and Al-Quds have never really seen this extent of bloodshed. It's completely horrific. But for a lot of us that are following this, we've, have felt a little bit of hope coming actually out of Africa, because much of the strongest resistance to the Israeli genocide in Gaza is actually coming from South Africa. South Africa is leading a case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, and has been backed by a number of African countries, including Zimbabwe, including Algeria, Namibia, and the Comoros. So what is the status of this case, Ahmed, and why is it South Africa specifically that is leading the international struggle against apartheid Israel and its genocide?
Obviously, there's the history. So there's two things. Firstly, the South Africans recognize what's happening in Palestine in general very closely because of their own experience. But also, Israel played a pivotal role in supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. Once the international boycott movement was underway, Israel was continuing to provide financial support and continue to do trade with the apartheid regime. So there's obviously that. Then the both liberation struggles used to train side by side in places like Tunisia. So it can understand what's going on in Palestine and understand settler colonialism as being a victim of settler colonialism. But I have to be a bit cynical as well. This ANC government in South Africa isn't very popular at all, especially amongst the black masses who, they didn't want the settler colonial regime to end because they wanted one man, one vote. They wanted their land back. And here we are, 30 years after the end of apartheid, and most black South Africans are still landless. The economy is still controlled by the white minority, white monopoly capital, as they refer to it in South African circles. So this was also a way for the South African government to re-establish its radical credentials, because for 30 years, it's kind of been seen as a neoliberal government, that has been collaborating with, not doing anything to redistribute the wealth and disrupt white monopoly capital, but in many ways collaborating with it. Ramaphosa, who's the president, is one of the richest men in South Africa, and he's got many, many business deals with the white European elite that control the economy. But yeah, that's an attempt of nuance. There's the history, but there is also, as always the case, there's always politics. So the rest of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's more genuine. So Namibia has been very vocal. That was also settler colonial regime from Germany. Again, they understand the struggle. Zimbabwe was known as Rhodesia, had another settler colonial regime. So in Southern Africa, you'll see so much support, in particular, for Palestinian resistance and for the Palestinian struggle, because that is where the settler colonial project was strongest in Africa. And so the similarities are there. But yeah, in other parts of Africa, in places like Kenya, it's the opposite, sadly. So William Ruto, straight after October the 7th, obviously made a very damning statement against Hamas. He's been very vocal in his support for Israel. And there's a history here. So under Donald Trump's first term, when Uhuru Kenyatta was the president, there was a trade agreement, a document between there was a bit of a Freudian slip, US and Kenya. And in that trade agreement, it said that Kenya cannot participate in any shape or form with BDS. So you have to ask yourself, why is there a trade agreement between an African nation and the largest economy on the planet predicated or having a conditionality on BDS in there? And this goes to show the role that Israel plays within the African continent. What Israel represents within the African continent is, are you a reliable partner for imperialism? Yeah, in my country of Sudan, we were a state sponsor of terror. We were listed as a state sponsor of terror. In 2020, in the lead up to the US elections, there was negotiations to lift this designation of the state sponsor of terror. Now, in all of the negotiations, the Israel wasn't mentioned. And then right at the last minute, Donald Trump said, if you want this state sponsor of terror designation, you have to normalize relations with Israel. Now, at the time, Sudan had a transitional civilian government that was sharing power with the military junta. The transitional civilian government said, this isn't a decision for us to make. This is a decision for an elected government in the future. But the US said, okay, well, then we're going to continue this. We're going to continue sanctions. So eventually, they submitted and signed that peace agreement. The so-called Abraham Accords. Again, that Israel represents symbolism. If you can normalize relations with Israel, then you are a trusted partner in a region where Russia and China seem to have influence. The US is looking for client states and recognizing and normalizing and signing trade agreements that you won't participate in BDS shows that you're more likely to be a trusted state and less likely to be a Zimbabwe or a South Africa or a Namibia.
Yeah, I guess we at MintPress have we designated Kenya as the US's African outpost because, of course, Kenya was really the face, the veneer of the repression of the Haiti revolts. The United States has 3 military bases across Kenya, of course, and from Kenya they use that to target Somalia in bombing operations, which Ahmed talked about earlier. President Ruto invited King Charles III to Kenya, despite the country fighting a bitter war of independence against the UK and suffering terrible massacres and terrible human rights violations from the British. Ruto, the president, has also really obediently followed IMF orders, imposing unpopular taxes on the population to pay back his paymasters in Europe and the United States. So, you know, it's a pretty bad situation over there politically for Kenya. But yeah, it's a really mixed bag when it comes to that continent. We've got people in the Sahel region, which suddenly has become the most interesting and radical and inspiring place perhaps on the planet. And yet there are other cases there which, you know, beggar belief about how corrupt and how miserable the situation is politically.
And is it possible that we do talk about Morocco kind of as our last point of topic here? Because when talking about Israeli influence on African nations, I think one of the most destructive relationships we've seen has been the one between Israel and Morocco, because it's kind of just right there by the Sahel, where this resistance is taking place against US, French, and Israeli colonialism and imperialism. But then you have Israel building this military alliance with Morocco, specifically to deter and push back against that resistance in the Sahel, but also to build its largest weapons company, Elbit Systems, because right now across the UK, Elbit Systems has been the target of course, Palestine Action. Palestine Action has now been proscribed as a terrorist organization, but I think we'll still see more resistance. But on the ground in Morocco, I would say the majority of the population does not support this relationship, this connection between Israel and Morocco. I mean, just yesterday, we saw one of the largest protests and marches in Morocco, in its capital. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to detest Morocco's alliance with Israel and demanding Morocco stop its alliance with the state of Israel and to assist in the siege, the illegal siege that Israel has imposed on Gaza. So I'm curious to know more about the relationship between Morocco and Israel and what damage this is causing in the African continent. And, you know, if you could just tell us more about that, Ahmed.
Sure. So there's a key point that needs to be added. It's also about the Morocco-Israel connection is also about Western Sahara. So Morocco is illegally occupying Western Sahara, and Western Sahara, off the coast of Western Sahara, is some of the richest fishing waters in the world, which Morocco gives access to the EU to. But most of the world doesn't recognize Morocco's illegal annexation or occupation of Western Sahara. So part of the Abraham Accords was, if Morocco normalizes relations with Israel, the US will then move towards recognition of Western Sahara as part of Morocco. And obviously Israel would recognize Western Sahara as part of Morocco. So this is a key part of the story, you know, and it just goes to show how these struggles are interrelated. And this is obviously a key part of friction between Algeria and Morocco, because Algeria not only supports the Palestinian right to self-determination, it also supports the people of Western Sahara's right to self-determination as well. And so that's what they're constantly clashing about. But yeah, Morocco, it is, you know, a combination of an EU client state within the African continent and a US client state within the African continent. And you're right to say that the population doesn't at all approve of this. You know, some of the best footage we've seen of solidarity have come from the football stadiums in Morocco. Some of their chants, you know, it can bring tears to your eyes. Some of the things that they say, you know, in the stadiums, and it's the whole stadium. It's not like a segment with one Palestine flag. It's the whole stadium in unison, you know, decrying their government and saying, you know, how they're all Palestinian. So it's a sad state of affairs, and it's sad that, you know, geopolitics is being played at the expense of the people of Palestine and the people of Western Sahara.
Alan, of course, we talked a lot about Israel and US imperialism inside of Africa, but we can't forget about the French and the British, and of course, the role that the IMF and World Bank plays in keeping these countries chained to modern day colonialism. I know this is kind of more of a general question, but could you maybe elaborate more on some current examples, modern day examples of how this still is a problem in the African continent?
Yeah, sure. It's an age-old problem. It's an age-old phenomenon that's been going on for decades, ever since the end of World War II and the post-colonial era, where in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, African states gained formal independence. But they didn't really ever gain economic independence, most of them anyway. As Ahmed talked about earlier, a lot of countries in Western Africa still use the CFA franc, which is a currency which is pretty much more or less completely controlled by Paris, which gives France an enormous, exorbitant privilege all over Western Africa to dictate these countries' economies and set those societies in a direction that is made to be serving France and serving the EU. The age-old story is that Western countries see revolutionary leaders like Patrice Lumumba, like Thomas Sankara, and they try to take these rulers out because of what they're saying. They're saying that the resources of Africa should be used to help the African people. And they do that. They foment coups. They bring in seriously unpopular military dictators. And then they ply these dictators with huge loans from the IMF and the World Bank. And these corrupt dictators use that money to go around and buy Western weapons in order to entrench themselves in power. And these countries get more and more in debt. And finally, maybe a couple of decades later, the people manage to rise up finally and rid themselves of these dictators. But they're not ridding themselves of the Western debt that these dictators have accrued. And so even though they are now formally independent and have perhaps more nationalistic rulers, they're still trapped into a cycle of poverty and debt because of this servicing that they have to do, whereby Western corporations fleece and take huge amounts, trillions every decade, out of Africa and drop it into the pockets of big financiers in Paris, in London, in Brussels, and in Washington, D.C. And this is the big picture of what's going on. And the way to break that, of course, is not only to study it, but also we need African unity, whereby countries come together and form a united front against imperialism, whether it's political or economic. And they say, we are not going to be paying these anymore. They're going to come together and, provide a much better future. Because as Ahmed has been saying many times now, and Ibrahim Traore, we heard earlier, say, Africa is not a poor continent. It's actually a very rich continent. It has been deliberately underdeveloped for centuries in order to serve as a material base for Western countries like the United States and those states in Western Europe. And that fundamentally has got to change. That is the relationship that absolutely has to be broken if Africa is going to remove its chains and rise properly to the place it should be.
Just to wrap it up here, I think a lot of people who may still feel a little bit confused about these issues would perhaps argue, okay, well, we push out US imperialism, But aren't these African nations putting themselves in a trap because now they're going to Russia and China, just two other, big world leaders? What is your response to that?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Before the European colonial project in Africa, Africa was doing trade with other countries in the world. We were trading with India, we were trading with China. Now, I hate to use this analogy, but it's almost like when someone is in an abusive relationship and you got that kind of friend that says, to hell with men or to hell with women. No, you were just in an abusive relationship with that man or that woman. And because we were in an abusive relationship with European colonialists and with Western imperialism, it doesn't mean we should be insular and cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. That is a fast track to nowhere. Yeah, so we need to do trade. We just need to do trade from a position of strength and do trade from a position of reciprocity. So it shouldn't be, an exploitative relationship. And the only way we can stop it from being an exploitative relationship is if, as Alan mentioned, is if we unite and we say that, you can't pick us off one-on-one, pick us off against each other. You can't say to Chad, if you don't do a trade agreement with us, then we're going to go to Central African Republic. And in Central African Republic, if we don't do a trade agreement with us, we're going to go to Uganda. If we come with a unified position, that way we'll get the best deal possible. We see that's what happens with the EU. The EU doesn't negotiate as Germany, as France, as Belgium. They negotiate as the European Union bloc. And so that's what we argue as revolutionary Pan-Africanists, that, we need to do trade with the rest of the world, but we need to do it from a position of strength. And the only way we can do that is if we unite our economic power, if we unite our military power, and we unite our political power. But yeah, people are right to have reservations, but they're not right into saying that, Africa doesn't need anyone else and we just need to trade with each other. That doesn't lead anywhere.
Well, as we see that, I think you have to just mute yourself one more time. As we see that, as China's pulling people out of poverty, they're not sending in their troops to overthrow a government, whereas the United States does do that kind of stuff. Always an imperialist state, will forever be an imperialist state. But anyways, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I wish we had more time. I really wanted to expand more on the Sahel versus the Sahara also, but we didn't get a chance to do that. So maybe we can do that for another conversation. Both of you hold such a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate you being here. I've learned so much from both of you. Thank you so much.